Well, this week too, we've seen the publication of the interim report by the US watchdog into what happened last August when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, concluding that the US and Afghan governments shared the blame. Well, I'm joined now by Hamdullah Mohib, who was the National Security Advisor to the former President Ashraf Ghani. Doctor, thank you so much for being here on the programme. When you see how quickly the clock has been turned back by the Taliban, how responsible do you feel?
Like that report says, it was a collective failure, and it's extremely sad to see that everything that we worked very hard for, thousands of sacrifices made, and this is what it amounts to. I would say that it's not that we didn't predict or warned our international allies about, and I'm glad that the Taliban do not have the legitimacy so that the world is still paying attention to Afghanistan. And
you talk about collective, you talk about the allies. What about your own personal responsibility?
I am as responsible as every other person there is in our government. We were all responsible, and I think it's going to weigh on us for the rest of our lives.
How surprised are you how quickly things have gone backwards?
Not surprised at all, in fact. While here, I met with some of our former colleagues with whom we had shared that this was exactly what we predicted is going to happen. The international community was extremely enchanted by the Taliban's changing narrative, and assumed that they could be controlled through aid in the way the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was. And we argued that to the Taliban, that kind of legitimacy does not matter. What they care about is the legitimacy in the jihadi world.
But inside 6 to 8 months, they have turned the clock back so quickly on so many different issues. You and Ashraf Ghani left the country that you abandoned Afghans to all of what we're seeing. I just want to play a clip from the former president, what he told the BBC about that actual day. Have a listen to this.
On the morning of that day, I had no inkling that by late afternoon, I will be leaving. Dr. Mohib, the National Security Advisor with the Chief of PPS, came and they said, PPS has collapsed. If I take a stand, they will all be killed. And they were not capable of defending me. And Dr. Mohib was literally terrified. He did not give me more than 2 minutes.
So there it is. You were terrified. You gave the president 2 minutes to decide. You saved yourselves, but you abandoned the Afghan people, didn't you?
Absolutely not. I think there has been a lot of propaganda around that, but we had 3 basic objectives. We did not agree with the situation with what our American counterparts were doing with the Taliban. But on that day, we did not have good options. What we had was bad options, and this was the best. And it saved the president's life. It saved the country, the capital from an infrastructure being destroyed, and it saved the lives of the people that were left. Had the president was extracted from a situation.
That's the first time I've heard running characterized as heroic.
Well, fighting when there was no future for it, and it would have been catastrophic to put more people at danger when there was when the same thing was going to happen in just 2 weeks' time. It was a matter of.
But how much danger? That's the question that people are asking on that day in the presidential palace where Ashraf Ghani was. How much danger was there? I want to play you another clip. It comes from the chief of staff who was there in the palace that day. Have a listen to this.
I don't know why he ran away. I don't forgive him for that. Because after, I'm again telling you, Liz, after everything was okay, if he had run away when Jalalabad had fallen, Parwan had fallen, some district around Kabul had fallen, there was no agreement between us, could have been understandable. Maybe he said, okay, maybe he was coward, he ran away. He ran away for his life. But after everything, some ceasefire put in place, a security arrangement even in place, that day, the palace was the safest place in Afghanistan. I don't buy that argument there was threat or anything.
I mean, that decision to leave, it had considerable, disastrous consequences, didn't it? Because you had Zalmay Khalilzad, the US envoy, saying that he was trying to negotiate with the Taliban not to enter Kabul, and that simply disintegrated the moment it was heard that you had left. Do you think that Ashraf Ghani could have been a Zelensky had he had more courage?
I think it's extremely unfair. One, that Ambassador Khalilzad had been offering solutions and promising that there would be peace in Afghanistan for 3 years. None of it materialized. We knew what he was saying was also not materializing on that last day. There was a plan for a negotiating team to go to Doha. I myself was negotiating that. But on the day when things unraveled at very fast pace, the best thing we could do was to ensure that, one, we save our own city. We save the people that are in that city. Yes, it was disastrous. Many people had to flee. Many people had to leave. But imagine if there was street-to-street fighting, those people who actually left would not have been able to leave either. The situation with the other political leaders who are alive today, because
you don't look at Ukraine and think to yourself, that is how you resist an oppressor.
Because Afghanistan did resist an oppressor. We fought the Soviet Union for 10 years. Zelensky has only been fighting for what, 3 or 4 months now. Afghan people had 1 million casualties against the Soviet Union. We sided with the United States then, and when the war was over and the government was toppled, the US walked away. Once again, we had 70,000 casualties in the war against the Taliban this time. The US decided to negotiate directly with the Taliban. In the end, tried to have Ambassador Khalilzad, tried to have the Ashraf Ghani be responsible to give legitimacy to the Taliban. And that is not what Ghani was going to do.
Let me turn to that report I mentioned in the introduction, because you touched upon it, and the interim report, it does blame the US withdrawal, absolutely very clearly. But it also talks of President Ghani being paranoid in the last few months, convinced that the US were going to replace him. And that led him, said the report, to replace military chiefs with his own cronies from the communist era who were loyal to him. And that had a crucial impact in terms of the military's preparedness, ability to actually resist the Taliban. Did you accept that conclusion, that assessment?
The president was not the leader of a political party. He did not have cronies to bring in that would replace others. He had the pool of the talent that was available to him. He did the best.
Why were those generals replaced in those months? The report says he was increasingly paranoid there'd be some sort of move against him.
I don't think there was. I think I read that report, and I know that the people who reported or read those report have their own concerns and have their own opinions, but that was not the fact. The fact was that there was only a small pool of people available at that time to be able to do the job.
You're the National Security Advisor. You're very close to Ashraf Ghani. Why were these people being replaced? Because a number of them were.
Many people couldn't handle the pressure. This was at a time of extreme stress. For those who were watching from outside, may think of scenarios that were available that were not taken, but that's not the case.
You don't think that's an insult to all of those people who you yourself earlier in this interview said had resisted for such a long time? You don't think it's an insult to say to them they were simply too stressed to keep going?
No, absolutely. The job of the job was extremely stressful, and people were able to do it for such amount of time. The Americans changed their commanders all the time. Every year they had someone new come into Afghanistan, because that is how the pressure was. They changed their commanders at a lower level in the same way. Afghanistan's conflict had been raging for so long. This report doesn't recommend or doesn't talk about. There were changes where many of the younger cadres were brought in who were trained by NATO, but they were younger. They were much younger, and sometimes had difficulty getting the respect of their fellow commanders.
Let me ask you another question, because you said in interviews before that you blame the Americans for simply pulling the rug in those last few months. But you knew Joe Biden campaigned on keeping Donald Trump's deal. You knew it was going to happen. What was so surprising? You're the National Security Advisor. You didn't know, for example, the Taliban were negotiating deals with local tribal leaders, which perhaps again explains why so many of those places fell without a fight. Why didn't you know these things?
Well, there are certainly some intelligence failures, but there was also issues with policy. What we didn't know...
But these are fundamental things I'm talking about. The
we're
American
talking
withdrawal, those sorts of deals that were going on the ground.
The American withdrawal was never a problem. We, in fact, wrote to President Trump and told him if he wishes to withdraw, that he negotiate with the Afghan government. Give us a fighting chance are the exact words I used in Washington to relay that if you delegitimize the Taliban, it will take away our fighting chance because it will take away our legitimacy in our own country. And just while that was happening, while we made those requests, Trump called Mullah Brother and told him that they were defenders of Afghanistan. And here are our partners.
But the administration changed. It became Joe Biden. He was quite clear he was going to push ahead. He pushed it back to September. You knew all of these things were happening, and yet you still accused the Americans of pulling the rug and blaming it entirely on them.
No, look. I started by saying it's a collective failure, but what we were not expecting was the Americans to also pull some of the enablers.
But you haven't articulated any of your failures. You keep repeating the American failures. What are your failures?
That's what you've been asking me about, and I have articulated our failures. I have actually written or done quite a few interviews since the collapse. I've talked about some of the things that we were unable to do, and that was political cohesiveness. We couldn't create a single narrative against the Taliban. There was no cohesiveness on the peace process. There were different ideas going around in defense of the Republic. The Republic itself was extremely divided, and so it was not able to bring along the public with it.
I know you've been asked many times about this question of whether the helicopter was stuffed with millions of dollars when you actually left. Why do you think it's so difficult to convince many Afghans of that denial?
I have categorically denied that before. There were a large number of people on those helicopters. And when it landed in Termiz, the Uzbeks went through the whole of the crew and everything and catalogued what was on those helicopters. I think this is an effort to divert attention from all of our collective failures to try to pinpoint something on Ghani to make him look like the bad guy. I'm not saying he didn't have his mistakes. I didn't have my mistakes. We all did.
You've talked to the Americans about the corruption that went on for decades, the billions that went missing. What did you tell the Americans?
Of course, there was corruption, and we tried in our earnest to try to eliminate. But eliminating corruption is a generations-long effort. Today, the Taliban, despite claiming that there was corruption in the Republic and that being one of the reasons they fought against it, are marred with the same problem. The regime of the Taliban is full of corruption. I know of personal instances where people have bought passports for themselves and paying the Taliban off, and there are videos of them circulating in the media. There is a problem in the system that needs to be fought against.
Two final questions. Going forward, how bleak is it in your assessment? The Taliban, as I said, have turned the clock back. How far can the clock go back? Can it go back to when Afghanistan was a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, and all the while in the backdrop you've got this humanitarian crisis?
We warned against this before the collapse, and I am concerned about the rise of extremism and the rise of jihadi groups in Afghanistan. But the Taliban are also digging their own grave by increasing their control over the people. You mentioned it in the beginning of your report: schools, women's scarves. They're doing this on a daily basis that's against the grain of the fundamental grain of the Afghan society, and they will not be able to sustain this for very long.
A final thought then. You've said twice in this interview, and I've heard you say it before, that there's plenty of blame to go around. Many Afghans inside of the country, outside of the country, would like to hear you simply apologise for your part that you played. Will you take this opportunity to very simply say, I am sorry for the bit that I played here?
Absolutely. I did it earlier today with other interviews, and I will say it. I'll look at the camera, and if you don't mind, I'll say it in Pashto and Dari. And I'll say it in Dari too, چیزی که مربوط به ما میشه. معذرت با مردم از مردم افغانستان میخوایم و میخوایم که چیزی که اشتباه شده جور کنیم. Of course. Well, I was talking to the Afghan people in this case because I know it's that anything that is related to my failures, I take full responsibility for and apologize for it. And I hope that everyone involved will be able to come forward and explain what the situation. We owe it to the Afghan people, we owe it to history, we owe it to the partnership and the sacrifices that we have made, that we clear this and learn from it so that we can offer a better future to the Afghan people, for the Afghan people.
Hamdullah Mohib, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to us here on BBC News. Thanks very much for your time.